The group of homebrewers that Audrey and Owen originally got together grew to become the home brewing club Quaff. We got some of the more senior Quaff members together, naturally over a few beers, to explain how what started as an ad hoc group grew into one of the most respected homebrew clubs in the U.S. and helped launch a revolution that continues to this day.
I was in Europe on a bowling thing. I was in the military and came back, and a good friend of mine, he's an executive officer on a submarine, and he was asked me at dinner, he says, how'd you like Europe? And I said, I mean, the beer was fantastic. And he had a beer, it was in one of these bottles you see with no label, and he says, give it a try. So I said, well, that's great. He says, well, you can make it too.
The group was always willing to share. That's the one thing I think that camaraderie, Quaff is more like a family, a home brewing family than just a club.
Bouncing the recipes and the beers off of the other Quaff members really helped, elevate the quality of the beers that I was making.
One of the homebrewers hanging around the early homebrewing scene was a young Paul Holborn.
Distribution chains just weren't set up back then. A lot of times we'd have to get it ourselves and bring it down.
And they were pushing the limit. I mean, these guys were homebrewers that were brewing beer that they liked.
We brewed what we liked, and they were generally the pale ales, some nice imperial reds,
barley wines, IPAs,
stouts, those sort of things.
This was not the normal beer that was available back in the 80s, and those guys were early pioneers.
A lot of people didn't even know about microbrews, so we'd get customers coming in, and they'd see our 4 or 5 different beers that we had on tap, which they never heard of course. And they were dumbfounded. Like, what is this? It's like, well, what's the closest thing you have to Bud Light? And I'd always pour a glass of water and give it to them and say, that's the closest we got right there.
People thought we were crazy when we told them we were going to start a brewery. We had to train every governmental agency, in the city that had never, licensed an operation like ours in the city about how to, treat an entity like this, and it was a very difficult process.
We got into a pickle where the state said, well, we're not going to give you a license until the feds give you the license. And the Fed said, well, we're not going to give you a license until the state gives you a license.
We told them what we were envisioning, and they thought Laverne and Shirley.
One of the guys on the opening team of Karl Strauss's brew pub was Scott Stamp. Stamp was buddies with Lee Dockstader, who he had met in the late 80s when they were both working together at a Black Angus steakhouse in Oceanside. They both desired to open a restaurant of their own and would meet after work to discuss the possibilities.
I think it was Lee who actually brought a homebrew for the first time, and certainly a beer I hadn't had before, and we kind of kept up at it, and that, I think in the back of our minds, was going to be the hook.
They eventually decided to start home brewing together and took the obligatory trip to Beer and Wine Crafts. They also joined the newly established homebrew club, Quaff.
When we opened, we had 10 beers on tap, which was kind of unheard of at the time.
We were sort of the first micro multi-tap, if you will, but not by any grand scheme. We just had to have something to sell.
We had about 6 months worth of cash before we were going to go under. And we met some individuals with the brewing equipment.
Was Callahan second?
It might have been, actually.
I think they might have been.
We built their brewery system, got them up and running.
It was a 3-barrel kettle, so that's 6 kegs at a time. This is about the time that Michelob Dry rolled onto the scene, and telling everybody that beer really didn't have to taste like anything, no aftertaste. And, there was some head scratching, wondering if we were, this is the right thing, and this was the town that embraced Corona so well.
In 1992, in a small strip mall in the Linda Vista neighborhood, Jack White, a recent college graduate and avid home brewer, decided to open a homebrew supply store.
Beer and Wine Craft at the time, Audrey and Owen were down here already for a while. I didn't start using their shop until I moved down here.
The other shop in El Cajon was way out in El Cajon, and a lot of people who live in San Diego proper think El Cajon is, like El Centro. It's 100 miles away, and You know, you just don't go there.
The fact that they were so far away, and I figured there were probably other home brewers like me, kind of inspired me to do something more centrally located.
A young home brewer, Yusef Chernay, was looking through a local newspaper and came across an ad for the newly opened Home Brew Mart.
I remember walking in and telling my girlfriend and my friend, I'm not going to apply for a job here, you know. And within an hour, I was, you know, of milling around the shop, and I said, hey, Jack, you need some help?
I was working it by myself at the time, and working my other job. You know, don't quit your day job, or in this case, don't quit your night job while you're trying to start this little hobby shop.
He looked pretty frazzled, so I think he waited maybe 12 hours before I got the call to come help him out. So that's how it all started down there.
In Linda Vista, things were looking up as Home Brew Mart was thriving and business was growing. Jack and Yusef opened an additional location up the coast in Solana Beach. Back at the original Linda Vista store, things were literally about to start brewing.
From the early days of being a home brewer, I definitely had the aspirations to start some kind of brewery. I kind of felt like the homebrew shop was a foot in the door for an inexperienced business person.
At the new store in Solana Beach, Yusef forged a fast friendship with his new neighbor, Vince Marsalia of Pizza Port.
They would come down and mill their grain at the shop, and you know, I would go up there and maybe drink a beer for free.
When it came time for Yusef and Jack to see how their home brews would fare on a larger scale, Vince let them brew on the Pizza Port Solana system.
Next to opening up our own place, that was one of the most exciting things that I remember doing as a brewer, is watching this beer go from, you know, a small homebrewed batch to this big tank that I'm actually pouring out of.
Jack and Yusef decided to put in a 15-barrel brew house at the back of their Linda Vista Home Brew Mart location.
To have the brewery in the back with the tasting bar separating the brewery from the homebrew shops. And I thought having them attached, they would feed off of each other. From the very beginning, we brew the beers that we like to drink. We're not doing any focus groups. It was me going out, you know, trying to sell the beer. I was naive enough to think, you know, if you just make this beer and you get someone to drink it, they're going to like it and they're going to put it on tap. I didn't really have a good concept of how the, you know, the industry worked. But eventually, with persistence, because, you know, it's the only thing I wanted to do, you wear people down. People are curious about this new local beer.
After PB Brewhouse closed in 1995, Skip Virgilio, together with fellow Quaff member Ted Newcomb, started a new brewery. They found an empty warehouse in a business park off Miramar Road and opened the AleSmith Brewing Company.
Ted and I did a lot of the work ourselves. The wait for equipment for systems was maybe as much as a year, and we didn't have a year, so we put together a system out of dairy tanks. In fact, every tank in the initial AleSmith brewery was a dairy tank. Ted and I were standing next to each other looking at this tank, and Ted was like, wow, we did it. And I was like, holy crap, we gotta sell this stuff. Who are we gonna sell it to? And it was a pretty tough sell. I mean, there were places like O'Brien's and Pizza Port where we were friendly with those folks and they were gonna take it from us whether it was good or bad because we were friends. But then we got outside that, you know, small group of folks, and we had to start knocking on doors and talking to people that really had no idea what craft brew was and certainly didn't care.
I took over the reins here at AleSmith Brewing Company. We had been around already 7 years. I used to volunteer here. AleSmith has always been known in San Diego for making very flavorful, full-bodied beers that cross the spectrum of styles. Well, I wanted to continue that and expand and introduce some of my own beers and change the beers a little bit because the flavor people want evolves as well.
I really had no intention of staying in the pizza business. It was just a vehicle to get down to San Diego. Then my brother came out to work for the summer. I just thought he'd have fun surfing and working for a while, and then when it came time to go back to finish college, he just kept staying.
Gina knew some people that made brewery equipment.
I built their brewery system in 1992, again, very early in the whole game.
There was no money, pretty much. I mean, they gave us some money, but they didn't really give us enough to finish the project. The drywall guy was plastering the wall, and I said, you have to stop there, because if you want to get paid, you have to stop right there. And he looked at me kind of funny, and I just said, really, I don't have any more money to pay. We have to start selling some beer. And we made our first batch of beer.
Shark Bite Red?
Shark Bite Red was the very first batch. I was training Tommy, and we were in the brewery for 15 minutes. And by the questions and the stuff that he was saying, I looked at him and I was just like, you know quite a bit more about this than I, don't you? And he said, yeah. And that was about it. And I said, well, I mean, if you have any questions, you let me know.
When I got to Pizza Port, it didn't take long before I hooked into a few bourbon barrels and then got some wine barrels as well.
The old Stone premises were quickly snapped up by the now rapidly expanding Pizza Port Group, who by 2005 were ready to add a full production brewery to supplement the output of their brew pubs. This facility would brew both the Pizza Port beers under the Port Brewing brand and Tommy's barrel-aged beers under the Lost Abbey brand.
Stone's building became available, and I think they had a few other interests, but they really were loyal to us, maybe because we got their first keg.
It was presented to me in the late 1990s when I first started working with Pizza Port about this idea that Vince had for a Belgian-type brewery, or a brewery that didn't have a monastery, that brewed Belgian beers. And it wasn't until we came to acquire the Port Brewing building that we realized we could do both. We could make Port Brewing beers and the Lost Abbey brand of beers in the same facility. It always came back to the Belgian mentality, which is, here was people making sour beer in barrels, here was people using weird ingredients, so why not us? Why not look at that aspect of old world traditions in brewing? So the Port Brewing brand was built upon a lot of the success that had been sort of found at Pizza Port with what I call American or West Coast craft brew style beers. Stronger, more intense flavor, higher alcohol, higher hopping rates, things that breweries like Stone and Ballast Point and others around San Diego had already really earned a reputation for doing.
Stone was the first real packaging brewery to send beer out, and their growth allowed us to piggyback San Diego beers to other states, other festivals, other events.
The real milestone for San Diego was when Stone opened, and I'm talking for big flavored beers. There were the brew pubs that were doing it in pockets over the town. No one had done it in a big scale yet.
And that aspect of taking and putting beer in a bottle and sending it outside of the region, and then seeing a lot of commercial and marketable success with their Arrogant Bastard and a lot of the other things that they were doing, they were generating quite a bit of buzz.
Well, I think when you talk about San Diego brewing and San Diego beers, you have to talk about Arrogant Bastard Ale. It's a seminal beer. It's a beer that's been so important to the industry here.
I think it's one of the beers that helps get San Diego on the map, honestly.
The real genius of the beer, the real genius, I think, is the name.
It sort of helped people that were used to drinking fizzy yellow beer, Greg's term, challenge their taste buds and try things that have bolder flavors. And I think that really helped snowball craft brewing.